Do you know the saying, nothing beats the original? And in the past decade, entertainment companies really want to challenge that quote. In the past couple of decades, there's been a good amount of remakes that have been made. And to be honest, most of these video game remakes are not terrible. Most of them are alright, but amongst the good, there's also the bad and the ugly. Let's take the GTA trilogy for example. So Rockstar took the game and their intention was to just remaster it, but they actually remade it to be more glitchy. And they took the base game's models and textures and they didn't remake it. It's just more like they modified it. So now the in-game textures, they just look odd and out of place because this is an old game. All three of these games are nearly 20 years old. So when you take an old game and you try to make it look more modern, it looks weird because that's not how the game was intended to be looked at. And while on the topic of video game remakes, there are two games that caught my eye. The Last of Us 1 remake and the Resident Evil 4 remake. And you know what I have to say to both of these? Why are they remaking the game? Like what's the point of remaking these games? Like truly, like these games are not even that old. The problem with the Last of Us remake is that I have to pay $70 to play the game. I mean, I don't have a PS5, so I mean, I can't really play the game either way. But I have to pay $70 to buy a PS3 game? And with Resident Evil 4, if the leaks are true, then this game is going to come out atrocious. The Resident Evil 2 remake was heavily beloved because it didn't stray too far away from the original source material. Everything that made the original Resident Evil 2 game special stuck around, and it just became more modernized. Not much about the game was changed, and it was honestly just slightly altered and modified to make it more modern. That's also why Resident Evil 3 didn't get as much praise as Resident Evil 2 did. Don't get me wrong, Resident Evil 3 is a fun game, but I mean the game overall is it's pretty decent, I guess. Unlike in the Resident Evil 2 remake where events happened in the game also happened in the remake, but of course changed to, well, make more sense and, well, make it more modern. In Resident Evil 3, it's different. Some content is just straight up gone. I mean, in Resident Evil 3, the entire Clocktown sequence, that entire sequence is not even in the remake. And I mentioned Capcom's decision on straying away from the original game's content because they may be doing the same thing for Resident Evil 4. And I love Resident Evil 4 the way that it is right now. This is one of my favorite games ever. And if the Resident Evil 4 remakes leaks are presumed to be true, then I can say with confidence that the Resident Evil 4 remake is nowhere near gonna be as good as the original. Because there was one leak that stood out to me the most, and it was that Krauser is not gonna be in the game and Luis is going to replace his role. If you're not familiar with the Resident Evil franchise and you have no clue who Krauser is, well, he's a mysterious guy, so fans don't really know much about him either. But either way, we don't need to know his backstory as a character. All we need to know is his association with Leon. And everything that Capcom did wrong with Resident Evil 3, they're going to do the same mistakes that they did for Resident Evil 4. A highly praised and beloved game. And that's the problem with most remakes. I wouldn't say that any video game remake is necessarily bad. To be honest, most are fairly really good. But in a remake, when you stray too far from the original, you fail to capture why people loved it in the first place. And yes, I am talking about these live action remakes of animations. They are absolute hot diggity garbage. I don't understand why studios always try to make animations live action because it never works. Like genuinely, can you tell me a live action remake that has beaten the original? You can't, because none of them beat the original animation. I hate the idea that people think that if something is live action, it'll be better. Because I'm telling you, shows and movies that were originally animated and they become live action, most of its heart is going to be gone. Let's take Disney. Yes, Disney. an animation studio that is now going on to remake their original animations that made them the big huge brand that they are live action. Why? And the biggest issues with these live action remakes is that the reason why the original was so good was because it was animated. It was because of its art style. It was how the world looked, how the characters looked. Like more than half of the visuals of the characters in the world is being made up through the animation. And with live action, there's only so much that you can do before you can't do it at all, or before it just ends up looking off. Like One Piece is about to get a live action adaptation, and all I have to say is, how are they gonna remake this? How are they gonna do that? How? Because Netflix sure as hell did not get it right for one of the greatest animes of all time, Cowboy Bebop. And it's because it's not animated. In the original Cowboy Bebop anime, Spike's movement is very fluid, and he's very cocky when he moves. But in the live action remake, it's not like that at all. He just fights like a trained soldier. And that's because it's a human making these movements, not an animated character. So taking an anime and making it live action is practically just degrading the reason why it was good. The fact that it was an anime, the fact that it was animated and given a certain art style and was supposed to be looked at a certain way, it just takes away from the original art. Look, if you like these remakes, so be it. I love certain remakes as well. I loved the Resident Evil 2 remake, and I loved the Final Fantasy 7 remake. Fantastic games. And I wouldn't say the Disney remakes are the worst thing in the world, but there are plenty of remakes out there that just don't do justice for the original creator. Look, I understand the fact that the original and the remakes are never going to be exactly the same, because if they are exactly the same, then it's gonna get ridiculed for not being a different story. The original is going to be special in its own right, and the remake is going to be special in its own right. Most remakes aren't absolutely terrible, like I said, especially amongst video game remakes. But I find it absolutely wretched when somebody takes somebody else's work, remakes it, and they don't even attempt to try to capture what made the original person's art special. Just imagine if the entire Star Wars franchise were to get remade. Not a soft reboot, completely remade. The same specialty that George Lucas was able to capture in the original Star Wars is not going to be in the remake. That's why I think some things are just best to be remained untouched. Not because it doesn't deserve to be remade, but because it doesn't need to be remade. And now these live adaptations and remakes are now just getting ridiculous because they're not making it with the intention to do justice to the original creators. No, they're doing it because they know that they're able to make some good fat dough from it. And it's such a degrading practice to the original creators. And I'm gonna be completely honest. If the Cowboy Bebop remake wasn't Cowboy Bebop and it was just more inspired towards it, I would say, this is not bad of a show. Because the remake fails to capture the same emotion that the original did. But I do think that this would have been fine if it was a standalone thing. Like with all these remakes, they are supposed to be based off of something else. They're not original titles. They're supposed to be based off of what they're titled on. So if you're completely straying away from what the original source material was, then just completely rebrand it to some other title, instead of trying to make some hefty cash from the original audience that loved this piece of work. Because I'ma be real, right? I'ma be completely truthful. Keep it a buck, keep it 300. The adult film industry be making better remakes than these high-end blockbuster remakes of original content. Because at least in these XXX